A light drizzle fell over the military cemetery, making the atmosphere even more somber. The wind rustled the American flag draped over the dark oak casket. Soldiers stood in rigid formation, their expressions solemn, while friends and family gathered around, their faces heavy with grief as they said their final goodbyes to Sully Hayes, a decorated war veteran. But among all the mourners, one stood out: Riggs, a powerful German shepherd, Sully's loyal companion. Normally disciplined and calm, Riggs was now restless, sniffing the air, pacing in circles. His unusual behavior caught the attention of those around him, but when the casket was lowered into the grave, everything changed. The dog lunged forward, yanking the leash held tightly by Callahan Cal Vickers, Sully's longtime friend. A deep growl rumbled from Riggs' throat, followed by sharp, relentless barking that echoed through the cemetery. People exchanged uneasy glances. "What's wrong with him?" whispered Marlo Marley, Hayes, Sully's daughter, pressing a tissue against her trembling lips. Riggs was acting as if something was terribly wrong. He moved closer to the casket, digging at the fresh soil with frantic desperation. His barking grew even louder, more urgent. It was as if he was demanding someone open the coffin. The soldiers tried to calm the dog, but he was uncontrollable. Then Delaney Lane Mercer, Sully's widow, raised a shaking hand and uttered the words that sent a chill through everyone present. "Open the casket." Silence fell over the funeral. People looked at each other in shock. The officiating officer hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face. But then he gave a nod. The grave diggers carefully pried open the lid. And when they did, no one was prepared for what they found inside. The lid of the casket creaked as it was slowly lifted, the hinges groaning under the weight of the silence that had settled over the cemetery. Every breath was held. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in the stillness. The funeral attendees, moments ago consumed by grief, now found themselves paralyzed by a mounting dread. Riggs, who had been barking furiously, suddenly fell silent. His ears pinned back, his hackles raised, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled in his throat. His body tensed as if ready to pounce. Callahan was the first to step forward. He had served with Sully, had fought beside him, had laughed with him in the rare moments of peace between battles. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned over the open casket, his eyes narrowing to focus on the face inside. Then he stopped, his breath hitched, his expression once stoic, now collapsed into one of absolute horror. His body wavered, and for the first time in his long, hardened life, Callahan looked as though he might collapse. The man inside the coffin was not Sullivan Hayes. Gasps rippled through the crowd as others dared to look. Marlo instinctively covered her mouth, her fingers trembling against her pale lips. Delaney took a staggering step back, her knees buckling as the weight of realization crashed down on her. The uniform draped over the body looked similar to Sully's, but not identical. The insignia was wrong, the medals out of place. Then someone whispered the most horrifying detail of all. "The hands! Look at the hands! They're bound." The man's wrists were bound together, the rope marks still faintly visible against the cold, pale skin, as if whoever had done this had taken them off just before sealing the casket. A collective shiver ran through those gathered. Lane's breath came in short, sharp bursts, panic clawing at her chest. "Where's my husband?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the silence like a gunshot. No one had an answer. Marley turned to Callahan, her voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" The officer overseeing the funeral, his face now pale and rigid, turned sharply to the funeral director. "Who prepared this body?" His voice was edged with steel, demanding answers. The funeral director, a thin man with sweat beading at his temple, swallowed hard. I don't know. There must be some mistake." But as Riggs let out another low growl, his eyes locked on the body as if sensing something deeper, everyone realized the same chilling truth. This was no mistake. Sullivan Hayes was missing, and whoever had been buried in his place had not died of natural causes. A heavy silence weighed over the cemetery, broken only by the distant rustling of the wind through the bare trees. No one moved. No one spoke. The reality of what lay inside the casket settled in like a dark fog, suffocating and inescapable. Riggs stood rigid, his breast shallow, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to strike. His eyes flickered between the corpse and the people around him, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to understand what he already knew. Callahan was the first to break the silence. He turned to the funeral director, his jaw tight, his voice rough. "You expect us to believe this is a mistake? Bodies don't just get switched like luggage at a damn airport." The funeral director, a man named Wallace Grayson, wiped at the sweat forming on his forehead. His hand shook slightly as he gestured toward the casket, his voice cracking. I don't know how this happened. We received the body through proper channels. The military verified it. I swear to you, Mr. Vickers, there was no sign of foul play." "No sign of foul play?" Lane's voice was sharp, brittle with the weight of her grief and growing fear. She took a step closer to the casket, staring at the unfamiliar face, the bound wrists. "Does that look like someone who died peacefully to you?" More murmurs rippled through the crowd, whispers filled with uncertainty and dread. Marlowe's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling with frantic movements. "Dad was supposed to be transferred from Germany last week," she muttered, half to herself. "I tracked the flight. His body landed on U.S. soil 2 days ago. How the hell did this happen?" A low, rumbling growl pulled everyone's attention back to Riggs. The German shepherd was fixated on the casket, his nostrils flaring. Then, without warning, he lunged. His massive paws slammed against the side of the coffin, his sharp claws scraping against the polished wood. The force sent a shockwave through the crowd. Someone gasped. "Get him off!" a voice shouted. Callahan moved to grab Riggs by the collar, but before he could, something shifted inside the casket. A sickening thud echoed as the weight of the corpse shifted unnaturally. Several people stepped back. Wallace Grayson paled, his lips parting in silent horror. He hadn't touched the body since the casket was sealed. That body shouldn't have moved. Lane's breath hitched. "Oh my God!" Marley clutched Callahan's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "What if—" She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "What if he's not dead?" The idea was absurd, impossible. But as they all stood there, staring into the casket, something in the air changed. A heaviness, a presence, the possibility that the nightmare was only just beginning. For a moment, silence strangled the cemetery. No one spoke, no one moved. The weight of the impossible pressed down on them as they stared at the body that should have been lifeless. Riggs remained tense, his ears twitching, his breath coming in sharp, deliberate exhales. Callahan felt his pulse hammer against his temples, his instincts screaming that something was very, very wrong. Wallace Grayson, the funeral director, wiped his sweaty palms against his jacket. His voice was barely more than a whisper. This isn't possible." His words trembled, as if saying them out loud might somehow make them true. But Lane Mercer wasn't interested in doubts or technicalities. Her entire body was trembling, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Check him," she ordered, her voice sharp despite the terror in her eyes. Hesitantly, Callahan stepped forward. The air felt thick, suffocating, as he reached into the casket. His fingers found a man's throat, pressing against the cold, sunken skin. He expected nothing. He expected to confirm what should have been the truth. But then, beneath his touch, faint, unsteady, but undeniable, a pulse. A sick, sinking feeling twisted in his gut. "He's alive," he rasped. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Disbelief painted every face. Marley clutched her chest, her knees nearly giving out. Wallace stumbled back, shaking his head violently. No, that's not possible." The military, his voice cracked. He was confirmed dead. But Callahan wasn't listening anymore. He was focused on the body, the subtle movements, the flutter of an eyelid, the twitch of a finger. The man wasn't just alive. He was waking up. Then suddenly, the corpse inhaled sharply, as if gasping for air after being underwater too long. His chest heaved violently, his fingers clawing weakly at the fabric of his uniform. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. The cemetery froze. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. And then, In a voice so hoarse it barely escaped his lips, the man in the coffin rasped two chilling words: "Help me." Panic spread through the cemetery like wildfire. The funeral that started as a somber farewell had now turned into something out of a nightmare. The man in the casket, who should have been dead, was alive. His breath came in ragged gasps, his fingers twitching as if struggling to regain control of his body. Riggs barked furiously, his instincts on high alert, as if warning everyone that something was terribly wrong. Callahan didn't hesitate. He reached into the casket, gripping the man's arm. His skin was ice cold, his pulse dangerously weak. "Stay with me," Callahan commanded, his military instincts kicking in. The man's lips parted, trying to form words, but only a dry rasp came out. His eyes darted around wildly, clouded with confusion and terror. Lane Mercer clutched her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. "Who is he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where's my husband?" Marley grabbed her mother's arm, shaking her head in disbelief. "Mom, what if Dad is still out there?" The thought sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over them. If Sully wasn't in this casket, then where was he? And who had done this? Wallace Grayson stood frozen, his face pale as a ghost. "We need to call someone," he stammered. "The authorities, the military. Someone needs to explain this." His words barely registered as Callahan focused on the man, struggling to breathe beneath him. He leaned closer, trying to decipher the faint murmurs escaping the man's lips. And then, in a voice so weak it was almost swallowed by the wind, the man choked out two words: "They lied." Callahan's stomach twisted into knots. He grabbed the man's uniform, his voice urgent. "Who lied? What happened?" But before the man could answer, his body convulsed violently. A gurgling noise escaped his throat. His back arched in pain. His breathing became erratic. "Damn it," Callahan muttered. "We're losing him." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the man's body went still. His head lowered to the side. His chest stopped rising. The weak pulse Callahan had felt moments ago was gone. And in the eerie silence that followed, a chilling realization sank in. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth. And now, they were running out of time to find it. A suffocating silence settled over the cemetery. The man in the coffin was dead again. His body, moments ago trembling with life, now lay eerily still. Callahan kept his fingers pressed against the man's throat for a few seconds longer, hoping, praying for any sign of a pulse. But there was nothing. He exhaled sharply, his hands curled into fists. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Riggs whimpered beside him, ears flattened, tail low. The dog knew whatever had just happened. It wasn't natural. Lane Mercer staggered backward, her hands shaking violently. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "He was alive. We all saw it. How does someone just die like that?" She turned to Wallace Grayson, who stood frozen, his face drained of color. "You need to explain this right now." Wallace's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked like a man on the edge of a breakdown. I don't know," he stammered. "The body was processed through the military. All protocols were followed. There's no way this should have happened." His voice cracked. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead. "I've worked in this business for 20 years, and I've never—" He swallowed hard. "I've never seen anything like this." Callahan took a step back, his mind racing. If the military had verified the body, but the wrong man had been buried, that meant someone had switched them deliberately, which also meant Sully's body, or Sully himself, was still missing. The implication sent a cold shiver down his spine. "This wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "Someone did this on purpose." Marley clutched her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she frantically searched for anything, any clue, any record that could explain what was happening. "Dad's flight landed 2 days ago," she murmured. "I tracked it myself. His remains were supposed to be transported straight from a military base to here." Her eyes flickered up, wide with fear. "So where the hell is he?" Before anyone could respond, Riggs let out a sharp bark and bolted toward the cemetery gates. His muscles were taut, his ears alert. He was tracking something. Callahan's instincts kicked in without hesitation. He sprinted after the dog. "Riggs has a scent," he called over his shoulder. "Stay close." Lane and Marley exchanged a fearful glance before rushing after him, their hearts pounding. Whatever Riggs had found, it could be the key to unraveling this nightmare, or it could lead them straight into danger. Callahan sprinted after Riggs, his boots pounding against the damp earth as the dog tore through the cemetery gates. The German shepherd moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground, following the scent only he could detect. Lane and Marley struggled to keep up, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they ran. The once solemn funeral had turned into a desperate chase for answers. The cemetery bordered a dense stretch of woodland, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the fading afternoon light. Riggs charged forward, weaving between gravestones and patches of overgrown grass, until he reached the edge of the woods. He stopped abruptly, his body tense, his ears pricked forward. Then, with a deep growl, he turned his head toward Callahan, almost as if urging him to see what lay ahead. Callahan slowed, scanning the area. At first, he saw nothing but leaves rustling in the breeze. But then, a disturbance in the dirt, fresh footprints. They weren't from the funeral guests. These were deeper, hurried, leading away from the cemetery. Someone had been here, and they had left in a hurry. His gut twisted. "Someone was watching us," he muttered, his voice low. Lane's breath hitched. "Are you saying—" She hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself. Who would be out here and why? Marley, still gripping her phone, took a step closer to the tracks. "These footprints aren't old," she murmured. "Whoever made them was here not long ago. Maybe minutes." Her voice wavered as she turned to Callahan. What if they saw what happened? The thought sent a cold shiver through Callahan's spine. If someone had been watching the funeral, watching the body twitch back to life, then that meant they knew something. And if they had run instead of revealing themselves, it could only mean one thing. They were involved. "We need to follow this trail," he said. His voice firm now. Riggs let out a low bark, already prepared to lead the way. Lane hesitated for only a moment before nodding, determination hardening her features. Marley swallowed her fear and took a deep breath. Without another word, they followed the footprints into the woods, unaware that with every step, they were getting closer to a truth far darker than they could have imagined. The dense canopy of trees swallowed them whole as they pushed deeper into the woods. The world behind them, the cemetery, the funeral, the life they had known, felt impossibly far away. Here in the thick of the forest, the air was colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The last traces of daylight barely pierced through the twisted branches above, casting elongated shadows that moved with the wind, making everything feel alive. Every step they took was met with the crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the only sound besides their own breaths and the faint rustling of unseen creatures. Riggs was leading the way, his body tense, his nose skimming the ground as he tracked the scent only he could detect. His tail was stiff, ears flicking sharply at every small noise. Callahan kept his grip firm on the handle of his knife, every nerve in his body on high alert. Something wasn't right. They weren't just following footprints. They were following a trail left by someone who hadn't wanted to be found. Marley wiped the sweat from her palms against her jeans, glancing nervously at Lane. "How do we know we're not walking into a trap?" she whispered, barely audible over the wind shifting through the trees. Lane's expression was unreadable, her jaw clenched. "We don't," she admitted, her voice calm but cold. "But if we turn back now, we may never find out what happened to Sully." The words cut through the air like a blade, leaving no room for argument. The footprints weaved through the undergrowth, sometimes fading beneath the thick layer of leaves before reappearing further ahead. Whoever had been watching them at the funeral had taken this exact path. Callahan crouched beside one of the deeper imprints in the soil, pressing his fingers into the disturbed earth. The dirt was still soft. He glanced up, his gaze sharp. "This isn't old," he muttered. "Whoever made these tracks was here maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, and they were in a hurry." A low growl rumbled from Riggs' chest, deep and guttural. The sound sent a shiver down Marley's spine. The dog's fur bristled, his stance rigid, his eyes locked onto something just ahead, something concealed by the darkness between the trees. Callahan followed his gaze, reaching slowly for his flashlight. He flicked it on, the bright beam slicing through the gloom. At first, there was nothing but trees, twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. But then his light caught something unnatural. A torn scrap of military fabric tangled in the underbrush. Right next to it, glinting in the flashlight's glow, a dog tag. Lane gasped, rushing forward before Callahan could stop her. She snatched the metal tag from the dirt, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. The name engraved on it sent a shock wave through her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. Sullivan Hayes. Her husband had been here recently, and he had left us behind. Whether by accident or as a desperate clue, she didn't know. Marley clutched her mother's arm, her voice tight with emotion. Dad's alive. Before anyone could process the weight of that revelation, Riggs let out a furious snarl. Then, in an instant, he bolted, his powerful body launching forward as he charged into the darkness, his instincts overriding any command to stop. Callahan's blood ran cold. "Riggs, no!" he shouted, sprinting after him. But the dog was already gone. Then, somewhere ahead, deep within the woods, came a sound, a low, agonized groan. Human, weak, close. Callahan tore through the underbrush, branches slashing against his arms as he sprinted after Riggs. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. Behind him, Lane and Marley struggled to keep up, their footsteps frantic against the damp forest floor. The groan they had heard moments ago still echoed in their minds. Low, pained, unmistakably human. Riggs was a blur of black and tan ahead of them, his body weaving to the trees with unrelenting purpose. He wasn't just following a scent anymore. He had found something. Callahan pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he broke through a thicket of tangled branches. And then he saw it, a figure slumped against the base of a tree, barely visible in the dim light. The man's body was draped in a tattered military jacket, mud and dried blood staining the fabric. His head hung forward, his breathing ragged and uneven. Riggs stood beside him, whining, nudging the man's arm with his nose. Callahan's stomach twisted. He knew before he even got close enough to confirm. "Sully." Lane choked out her name, her voice cracking as she stumbled forward. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering inches from his face, as if afraid that touching him might break the fragile moment. Slowly, Callahan crouched beside her, reaching out to feel for a pulse. His fingers pressed against Sullivan Hayes' throat, weak, faint, but there. "He's alive," Callahan murmured, relief flooding his voice. Marley let out a sob, clamping a hand over her mouth. Lane's fingers brushed against Sully's cheek, her touch feather-light. "Sully," her voice trembled. His eyelids fluttered, his lips parted slightly. It took several agonizing seconds, but then his eyes opened, bloodshot, clouded, but aware. He stared at Lane for a moment, as if trying to remember her face. Then his lips moved. "Lane." A broken whisper, a single syllable that sent fresh tears streaming down her face. Callahan moved fast, slipping an arm under Sully's shoulders, ready to lift him. "We need to get him out of here now." But as he shifted Sully's weight, the wounded man groaned in pain, his body stiffening. Callahan froze. His instincts flared. Sully wasn't just hurt. He was terrified. "Wait," Sully rasped, his hand gripping Callahan's arm with surprising strength. His eyes darted around the forest, wide and wild. "No, not safe." He coughed, wincing. "They're coming." A cold dread settled over Callahan. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Marley swallowed hard. "Who's coming?" Sully tried to answer, but his body was too weak. His eyes rolled back slightly, his breath growing shallower. Riggs let out a warning growl, his gaze snapping toward the darkness beyond the trees. A rustling sound echoed through the woods. For steps, more than one pair. Callahan's grip on his knife tightened. They weren't alone. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a bolt of adrenaline through Callahan's veins. His grip tightened on his knife, his breath steady, but his muscles coiled like a spring. Riggs stood rigid beside him, ears pinned back, a deep growl vibrating in his chest. Lane clutched Sully's hand, her knuckles white, while Marley hovered close. Her wide eyes darted between the shadows of the trees. The forest around them was no longer just a collection of twisted branches and shifting shadows. It was a battlefield waiting to erupt. Sully coughed weakly, his fingers twitching against the damp ground. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Run," he rasped. "They won't let me leave." His eyes flickered toward Callahan, pleading. "Please, take Lane. Take Marley. Get out." But Callahan wasn't leaving, not without answers. "Who?" he demanded in a low voice. "Who's after you, Sully?" A heavy silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then a voice broke through the darkness. "You weren't supposed to find him." Callahan whipped around, his knife raised, his pulse hammering. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light. Their movements were calm, deliberate. One of them, a tall man with a clean-shaven face and cold, calculating eyes, took a slow step forward, hands in his pockets as if this were nothing more than an inconvenient business meeting. The emblem on his jacket made Callahan's blood turn to ice. Military, but not standard, not official. Lane gasped, her grip tightening on Sully. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man tilted his head slightly. "The ones cleaning up the mess," he said flatly. His gaze flicked to Sully, then to Callahan. "You should have left him in that grave." Callahan's grip on his knife didn't waver. "If you wanted him dead, why bury him alive?" The man let out a short, humorless chuckle. "We didn't expect him to last this long." His eyes darkened. "And we certainly didn't expect you to dig up what was meant to stay buried." He took another step closer. "But we can fix that." Before Callahan could react, the man's hand moved toward his hip, a gun. Callahan lunged without thinking. His military reflexes took over. His knife slashed through the air, slicing across the man's arm before he could draw his weapon. The man stumbled back, cursing. Riggs launched forward with savage snarl, clamping his jaws onto the leg of one of the other figures. Chaos erupted. Marley screamed. Lane shielded Sully's limp body, her own shaking. Callahan tackled the man with the gun, driving him hard into the ground. Fists flew. A gunshot cracked through the night, missing Callahan's head by inches. Riggs snarled, his teeth sinking deeper into flesh. The second attacker crumpled to the ground, writhing in pain. Callahan wrestled the gun from his opponent's grip, his knee pressing into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" he barked, his breath ragged. The man sneered up at him, blood trickling from his split lip. "You already know." And Callahan did. This wasn't just about Sully. This was bigger, deeper. A secret someone had tried to bury, literally, and now they had failed. Behind him, Lane sobbed as Sully's weak hand gripped hers. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Marley clung to her mother, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. Riggs, despite his exhaustion, stood guard over the unconscious attacker, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for more threats. It was over, at least for now. Callahan exhaled, his grip on the stolen gun steady. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low, firm. "And if you come after us again, I won't miss next time." The man on the ground smirked through bloody teeth. "You think this is over?" His chuckle was almost amused. "You just uncovered the beginning." Callahan didn't care. He turned away, helping Lane, and Marley lift Sully to his feet. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had him now, and that was all that mattered. As they disappeared into the night, the truth remained buried in the darkness behind them, but not forever. Some graves were never meant to stay closed.